Okay, so good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our, I don't know which one of this is, the sixth or seventh of these meetings so far. So glad you're with us. Um, just to let you know, Phil Schwalier is on with us, but if anybody asks, he's not working this week because he's officially retired, and part of his agreement is to retire, take a week off, and then come back as a consultant. So you didn't see him here, and I am recording it, but we'll just have some fun there. So he's going to talk, of course, about thinning a little bit after I get through some weather, insect, and disease stuff. So the weather stations are catching up quickly to kind of more normal levels. We're actually, I think, farther ahead than we were last year at this time. Base 42 we use for insects and tree development of the Sparta station. This is through last night, midnight, is at 706, which is only about 3 days behind the normal averages for 40 years of weather data. And for base 50, we're about 3 days behind as well at 355. So as I mentioned last week, you could see how quickly in just down here at the bottom, I kind of keep the running total of how far behind or ahead we are week to week. And just a couple weeks ago, we were 2 weeks or more behind, particularly in base 50 because it was so cold. And we've quickly surpassed that. That actually really surprises me. When you get to this time of year, it's hard to really change that quickly, but especially in base 50 because we were so far behind, they just leaped forward, and those extremely warm nights really pushed that. So looking just ahead to your forecast, we had showers last night. I haven't really heard if anybody had any hail. They were watching it on the news for some when they use their infrared type of sky view. It looked like there could have been maybe some cells off to the east that perhaps had some rain in them, or I'm sorry, hail. But I think most people just got some winds. So I'll come back to that when I talk about fire blight in just a little bit. But they're calling for perhaps some light showers, I guess, into Thursday, but a nice stretch of weather here. You're going to really want to listen to what Phil has to tell you about thinning because it's a good stretch of weather to get some good thinning done. And then for a good pleasant weekend, and then the heat and humidity is going to move back in a little bit next week is what I'm hearing. And with that, of course, comes more convection in the atmosphere, more moisture, so more chance for showers. But more kind of normal early June temperatures, at least at this time. And also looking at Wonderground, very similar conditions. You see up here at the top, there's 0 for several days in a row for rain. So that's a pretty good indication that that's going to be the kind of dry and cool streak that we're going to be moderate set of weather conditions we're going to have for the next several days. And then moving into next week, Tuesday and Wednesday, they've got some better chances of rain. Of course, that's out a week from now, but you can see that reflected here. It looks like there's some low pressure perhaps coming our way. But this high pressure, this black line is barometric pressure, high pressure in place for the weekend. It's going to keep probably very clear skies and not too many clouds. So should be lots of good opportunities for spraying. And I also look at wind, which wind is very hard to get a forecast on, but definitely looks like there's a trend starting late Saturday, most of Sunday and Monday for very low wind conditions, but we'll see how that pans out. And then here we are in the apple pest guide, right between petal fall and first cover. So let's talk about some of those insects that are there. Plum-cuculio made a big presence last week, and kind of exciting to see how quickly they did some damage with those really warm nights. You have temperatures above 65 at night, and Plum-cuculio is gonna really get going in their egg laying. So They have a certain amount of eggs every year, and it takes them a certain amount of time to get through them. And if the conditions aren't right, that egg laying time period can be shortened. But we're in some nice conditions, so they're going to lay their full component of eggs most likely. They'll be busy at it as long as the nights are warm. So I think probably another week or 10 days, just make sure you've got cover sprays that are keeping you covered, and following back up if you get any rain. But for the next several days, it looks like whatever you have out there for plum cuculio is going to stick around. I think it'll end quickly this year because they only have a certain amount of eggs, and when it's nice and warm, they just lay them all and they're done. They don't lay more because it's warmer for a longer period of time. So there are degree day models available. They indicate we're about 25% done. I actually think we're probably farther along than that, and maybe need 10 days, maybe 2 weeks in areas farther to the north to finish up with plum cuculio. For codling moth, I set a biofix for the 25th of May. I know some people were catching them in high pressure blocks maybe a week before that. Just really, they were kind of, it was cool, so they weren't flying in extreme numbers, but they were showing up in traps because of high pressure. But when we had that warm weather, they really flushed out, and all of a sudden, all traps were catching something except in the very lowest pressure block. So we're just at 100 degree days. I have the degree day chart here. Since the biofix, this is using data from the Sparta weather station. So 100 degree days indicates by Monday or yesterday, we were just the start of egg laying. So that's important if you're using materials that target eggs, such as Ryman. Ideally, that kind of chemistry gets put down on top of the leaves, and the eggs get laid on top of that pesticide, and then they're killed in that way. So that needs to go on earlier than the more traditional timing, which is kind of 3% egg hatch for most of our materials that go after the small new hatching larvae. And I extrapolated out some degree days here based on normal temperatures. We're going to hit that 250 or early egg hatch sometime about a week from now. So for those of you that are over 5 moths per trap accumulated for the season so far, that means that would be when you pull the trigger on those more traditional materials that go after small larvae. If you have really low pressure and you're just not catching very many, you probably likely to target this 20% egg hatch, 350 degree days, and looking ahead, that's estimated to be sometime around the 14th, 15th, 16th of June. Again, I'll update this next week. This is just based on normal degree day accumulations per day for this time of year, but that can, we know, it's been a roller coaster with hot and cold conditions this year. So just helping you plan ahead a little bit when you're looking at perhaps when your first cover spray is going to be, and if it includes codling moth. So that, just to reiterate, the threshold in non-disrupted blocks for codling moth is 5 accumulated moths for traps. We catch 1 week, 3 the next week, and 1 the next week. You are now over that threshold. That means if the males are finding the traps, they probably could find the females, and those are in your 1X traps. There's some confusion because there's some 10X traps that are out there as well, but all decisions for sprays are made on 1X traps. The 10X traps we use in our disrupted blocks, because ideally if you're disrupting and it's working well, you're not catching anything in the 1X traps, because that's supposed to indicate that the males are not finding the females. If they can't find the trap, they can't find the females. What happens is when our disruption is working really well, or you've been doing it for several years, we never catch any moths in the 1X trap, and then we wonder if it's working, or it's a little unnerving to not catch any. And it's a little unnerving to say you don't have to spray. So the 10X is just to tell you what the background noise is, to say, yeah, they're out there, but you don't necessarily base your decisions on the 10x traps. So you should have in your disrupted blocks, for every maybe 4 or 5 1x traps, you should have one 10x trap, just to kind of tell you what's going on. It's good to put those too maybe along your edges, where if you've got a woodlot or a neighbor that has a little problem with codling moth, just to let you know what's going on and what might be moving into the orchard. So aphids, I can find rosy apple aphids. This picture is actually from last year, but this is not quite this bad yet, but they're getting there. I don't really see any beneficials, but I do see syrphid flies flying around, and so maybe by next week we'll start to see some of those midge larvae and ladybug larvae and green lacewing larvae start to show up in our aphid populations. They are more present in green apple aphids than necessarily in rosy apple aphids. We have a lot of expanding new tissue growth that is, it might be growing through your pesticide cover sprays really fast, so aphids will find that and move in, so just make sure you stay covered up there as needed. Oblique banded leaf roller, I haven't found any pupating larvae yet, but they're probably just starting to pupate. They're getting to be pretty large size, but there's still some small ones out there as well. Typically, I start catching those summer adults usually around the 10th or 12th of June. So if you have blocks that you want to monitor for adult flight, you can get those traps and lures up now so that you have them out there ahead of when that first flight might be. But as soon as they start moving into the pupating stage, of course, then they're not feeding, and it's nearly impossible to kill them with any pesticides at that time. So we've had some great weather this year for BT sprays, and I hope you've been using those because they should be helping you with leaf roller as well. San Jose scale, I did set a biofix for June 1. I caught just a few, so and it is they're starting to fly around the state as well. So that doesn't mean that everybody would use that biofix, but I'm trying to hit a target here for the region. And so just in that one day, since I did this yesterday, so just in that one day we've had like 8 degree days. Use base 51 for San Jose scale. So your target sprays, the degree day model that you use, I think it is up to 450 degree days base 51 before first crawlers are expected. So we've got a long ways to go yet before we would target those. We'll talk more about that in a couple weeks. Just to remind you what they look like, this male here looks giant on the screen, but they're extremely tiny. They almost look like just giant dust on the traps. And this is the scales on the branches that you would be looking for to see if they're present at this time. Again, also very hard to find. Moving on to Oriental fruit moth, they're well into their flight. The biofix was back on May 22nd. We're at 206 degree days. Since then, actually 232 if you add in yesterday now. So we're well past the beginning of egg hatch, 8 to 10% egg hatch. So when we say you need to start getting covered up to prevent this type of injury in stone fruits. This first generation will target the growing shoot tips and bore in, and on peaches, a lot of your crop for next year is on 1-year-old wood. This is that wood, and if it's compromised, you're going to compromise your future peach crop, so it's good to manage for it. And then peak egg hatch will be out here sometime in a week or so. So you need to stay on top of Oriental fruit moth cover sprays in your stone fruits at this time, and reapplying when you get enough rainfall that would take that cover spray off, or every 10 days to 2 weeks, depending on the product you're using. European red mites, I think they all came out and hatched at once with that warm weather, because I see a lot of immatures. I haven't seen any new adults yet, but I wouldn't be surprised if they move quickly through their life cycle with that really warm weather we had. Heavy rain will help wash them off a little, but we haven't had extremely heavy rain since they started hatching. So as more and more orchards add in late season pyrethroids for your brown marmorated stink bug management, just keep in mind that that could trigger red mites because you're removing the good beneficials that you have that normally are keeping them in check. And I haven't seen the explosions that I expect in some of those blocks, which is great. But hopefully you've all got your pedal-fall miticide sprays on now. I think they'd be very important for this year to keep this pest at bay. So I haven't seen adults yet, but as soon as they start showing up, of course, then there's more eggs and more adults then. So just keep an eye on them. White apple leafhopper, you can find small little nymphs out there, and also some potato leafhoppers now. And other people in the state have mentioned it as well. I think they came up with the last storm front from the south. They literally rain down out of storm clouds as adults. So you bright green bright green leafhoppers out there will be potato leafhoppers, and right now I think all the white apple leafhoppers are still in the nymphal stage, not particularly high in number, but something to keep an eye on, particularly on young trees, non-bearing trees that aren't getting the routine cover sprays for insecticides. Sometimes these sucking pests, aphids and leafhoppers, can get a foothold in there and do a real number on trees when you're trying to maximize your shoot length. I'm keeping black stem borer on the report just because it's still out there and active, and you can find these little sawdust toothpicks if you know right where to look. These will get washed off very easily in the rain. In some trees, well, I cut through it, and you can see they bore right into the heartwood of the tree. This is why I think many of our sprays are not very good at managing, or they look like they don't work well. I think they can kill the beetle. It's just that the beetle is not where the pesticide is. They bore in and they move right into the heartwood of the tree. They're not feeding on the cambium tissue. If there was something that was there that for them to feed on, and they're not spending a lot of time crawling around on the surface to pick up any pesticides. So they're just using this tree for a home for their larvae. I also think many of these trees already have one foot in the grave from some other reason, and particularly winter injury or wet feet or some other reason that made the tree give off signals and attract them to them anyway to begin with. So I'm not sure putting pesticides on will help with the life of the tree if this tree is already destined for removal just because of the horticultural conditions. But when you see them, sometimes there can be a great number of them on the tree. So each one of these little circles is where there's a little toothpick coming out. There's probably other ones that I just can't see that are small, tiny little holes. They can be very hard to find. I added dogwood borer to the report this week because they're moving into this stage where you start to see some of the pupating, the pupal cases start sticking out of the burr knots. And if they are empty, that means the adult has reached maturity and emerged, and this is the adult. They're actually a moth. They look like a wasp because of the clear wings, but they're actually a moth. But you want to look on these burr knots, and you can see this not very clear picture, but up here some of this brownish, orangish frass. If you dig around in there with the point of a knife, sometimes you can find the larvae or the pupae in there to see them active. And if a few in the burr knots is probably not a big deal, but sometimes they can have several of them in there, and we think that compromises the tree. They typically start flying right about now. The dogwood borer does, and we target their peak adult flight for our trunk sprays, which is usually around the 4th of July. So they usually fly for 8 or 9 weeks. So a month from now, they hope they will probably be at their peak flight. So consider that. Also, lesser peach tree borers have started to fly. American plum borer just started flying. And the greater or and what we call just peach tree borer. It's really not greater peach tree borer, but some people call it that. Should start to fly at any time. Borer sprays for stone fruits. The peach tree borer, American plum borer are usually timed for the kind of that last week of June, which will probably be about the right timing for this year as well. So just quickly moving into scab, this is the table for Sparta. And I just want to really point out the last couple of things here in the last week. So last week we had pretty heavy infection, over an inch of rain, 66 degrees, so wonderful conditions for apple scab, wet for 34 hours. I had 285 spores per rod, and the rain before that, 195. So they're starting to decrease. We are now crossed over. Once you get past 1,030 degree days, base 32, the model says 100% of the spores should be mature. So we've just passed that with this rain last night. Actually, at midnight, it was 1,030 degree days, base 32. So 100% of the spores for most of the stations, except with the exception of those farther up north, should be mature. And we do need a little bit of rain to discharge them. So I went and grabbed spores this morning, and I got up to 15 partway through one rod. So they're very spaced out. There's not a lot of them on there. There's a lot more pollen on my spore rods. So if your allergies are bothering you, I can see why. But I'm going to finish counting them when we're done here. I just ran out of time, and I have a partner who's helping me, and he's still looking. So that's my pug, Oliver. He's no help at all, quite honestly, but he tries. So here we are on this curve when we're above 1,032 degree days. That's when we estimate, and again, it's just a model, estimate when all spores should be mature. That just means they're there and ready to be discharged anytime we get a rain event. So for RimPro, it's indicating the same thing. I zoomed in on, it's predicting the rain for that little bit of rain maybe for tonight, or tomorrow, that was on that forecast. And perhaps some spores would discharge, and there's a little bit here still way out on the 5th of June for the little yellow bars that you can see. So we're almost there. But I think it's safe to say you need to have primary fungicide rates on it at least through the next week to make sure. I do think I'll catch a few more spores yet. Now keep in mind, my spore rods are in a orchard that is, it's a managed orchard, but they're pretty big woolly trees, so it probably is going to have more scab than a well-managed block that's pruned well. However, we did have scab last year, so I think all of you have a little more inoculum this season than any other season. So don't drop the ball just yet on primary scab. Looking at Standale crossed over that 1,030 degree day mark a few days ago, and so they've with the rain now they're well past 100%. I don't check spores down there, but I bet you they need probably one more rain as well to completely discharge all the spores in that area. The other thing to keep in mind are all these scab infections from, well, these three here from the last 2 weeks are all going to potentially start showing up. These are when we had some pretty big spore discharge numbers here, the highest that we had. And so you need to make sure you're good and clean of primary scab before you cut those rates. And not all of the primary scab that could show up has shown up yet. So another reason to kind of keep those fungicide rates up a little bit longer. RimPro for Standale is showing that this last bit of rain, I think, was the last of the spores, potentially, but there's no other real rain in the forecast to trigger more spores. So that makes sense because Standale's probably 3 or 4 days ahead of the ridge. And up north, the farthest north station we have is the Etna station in Fremont. They had some light rain last night. You are at 961 degree days since green tip. We set it back, set a biofix at green tip. So you're 99.7%. I think you need probably another good 10 days a little farther north. So we're almost there. Again, this is the Fremont station. This is the station at Riemann, which is a little south of the Etna one, but they're indicating the same thing, a little bit of a yellow potential spore discharge here and out into the future on the 5th or 6th of June as well. And then for those of you in Belding, this rain event was an infection for you. Oh, I didn't mention that not everybody had enough wetting. It was close, but most people did have just enough hours of wetting with the rain last night to be a light infection. But not everyone did around the region, but most of the ridge proper did. So Belding has crossed over that magical 1,030 mark as well, and now you just need a couple of rains to get those spores out. I'm just going to quickly touch on fire blight since bloom is over, just kind of recap what happened. So this is Standale, the data from Standale. It's a little hotter down there. Bloom started a little sooner. I shut bloom off on Sunday. I put petal fall in on Sunday, May 31st for Standale. I think I went a day longer. I'll show you the Sparta data. And when you do that in Mary blight, it stops showing you what the EIP is. And it stops giving you this risk for blossom blight because there's no blossoms there to be at risk. So I just wanted to explain that. But you can see we had some pretty extreme events here, over 400 on the EIP as it turned out for the 27th, and 3 infection periods in a row with rain all 3 of those days. The other thing that Mary blight does very well, that I don't think you can see this on EnviroWeather, is it predicts when those first symptoms from blossom blight will show up, and that's in this column right here that says blossom. So this first infection is labeled A, the second one will be B, and this third one here will be C. So if you follow the letters here, A, when it crosses over 100, that means that potentially that first infection could start showing up as visible symptoms. And it's really the first initial wilting of tissue, not fully dried down brown tissue, but the first initial wilting of tissue. So that's on Friday of this week, June 5th. And then the second one will show up on Saturday, and the third one will show up on Sunday. Because it was so warm, and then it's been warm, they're going to be piled right up on top of each other. You won't be able to tell the difference. So hopefully you don't see that. The Sparta data and the other stations that I look at look exactly the same. Hopefully you don't see that, but that's when you need to start watching for it. The other thing that the Mary blight does is there's a canker model. So canker margin symptoms, the CMS, should have started showing up right about the same, and it always happens that way. They show up right about the same time as these infections showed up. That just means there's oozing cankers, just adding more potential bacteria to the situation. And then CBS is the canker blight symptoms, so that means the shoots associated with those blights, with those cankers, can actually start to collapse, and that'll be about the same time as well. The other thing I did for Standale, just because they were mentioning hail last night, I put hail in. And I just wanted to talk a bit about trauma blight, if I could. Trauma blight doesn't matter if you have bloom present. And so you can see what happens if I put hail in. There was no rain associated. It doesn't matter. If you have hail, you always have rain associated. But the way the Mary blight model works is it doesn't matter if you don't have a rain event. So it's a little bit different than blossom blight. It will start clocking over here in this last column on trauma, regardless of rainfall. And when it gets to 100, that's when it usually takes 9 or 10 days for potential trauma blight symptoms to show up. So had you had any hail or high winds, I don't know how much wind is too much wind for fire blight, but if you had ripping and tearing of foliage, I know there were a few leaves on the ground. I don't feel like in my area that it was too terribly windy last night, but I understand there were some other areas that had more severe weather. That will probably start showing up around maybe the 10th or 11th of June. I'll keep tracking that for you as well. So hopefully that didn't happen for you, but it was a possibility. This is the Sparta data. You can see I turned the bloom off one day later, and really everything else is stacking up very similar. They had Sparta Station ended up with 4 days in a row because the rain got stretched out a little bit into 4 days. So 4 days in a row of potential infections. A little lower on the EIP. I think the temperatures here were a little lower. Standale had temperatures recorded over 90, and Sparta came in at 89.8. So that makes a difference on how the EIP gets tracked. But all the symptoms are going to show up around the same time, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday of this week. So do keep an eye out for that as well. And then if I keep bloom going, because some of you might have some newly planted trees that maybe are just coming into bloom, it keeps this it keeps tracking all the little pluses and minuses then, and it keeps us at a high risk for the potential if we were to get rain. The only thing that's missing here is rain. So if I had put the rain in for last night, this would have turned into an infection. So just keep that in the back of your mind for new trees that are you planted them and they're growing out of sync a little bit. They might not bloom at the same time everything else bloomed. So this is that first initial symptom that I'm talking about that you would see. You almost miss it, and hopefully you don't see it later this week, but do keep an eye out for it. We certainly were challenged with fire blight in bloom time this year. And then of course after, if it's warm out, after this can turn into this in just a few hours. By the end, it'll look like the wilting at the beginning of the day. It'll look dried up and more brown by the end of the day. And then oozing, of course, just adds more to it for any potential future storms, and hopefully we don't get any of that with hail or anything later on. And then just a reminder again not to confuse Nectaria twig blight with fire blight, particularly if you I have Rome highlighted. Rome is very good. It has this borscht shoot here, or sometimes called a purse. It's a little fat area of tissue, and sometimes it's subject to winter injury. I don't expect there to be as much this year because it was a mild winter. I wouldn't expect a lot of tissue injury, but the fungus moves in here and affects that, and then it pinches off at the base here, and then the shoots start to wilt. And then on first glance, it'll look like fire blight, but look a little closer, especially if you're looking at Rome's. We see it a lot of times in Gala as well. And then just a reminder about mildew, some banner weather last week for mildew with high humidity, and it's out there, and it's once you get to this stage, there's millions of little spores there that are flying to new tissue. So if you're starting to see any mildew, you need to keep something in the tank for mildew as well. That's all I have. I went a little long. I'm sorry. I'm going to turn it right over to Phil.
Well, Amy, what do you think about the winds that we had as far as fire blight and trauma blight?
At my house, I don't think the wind was that bad. But looking back at the radar signature for the night, I don't think I was under one. Here at Kennel on 12 Mile, I wasn't under one of those big cells. If you see leaves on the ground, branches are one thing, but if you see leaves, where it looks like things got tore up, I think you need to be concerned. That's a point where if the leaves are on the ground, that means, the leaves still on the tree could have little micro fissure breaks in them, and that allows bacteria to get in, and fire blight is there. It's present on all surfaces. So if you're worried about that, right now your only alternative is strep. And I know many of us on the ridge have confirmed strep resistance, but it's probably the best you can do. I guess you could use copper, but that's kind of a big hammer, and it'll affect your fruit finish. So I might hold off on that until you really know what's going on with fire blight.
And if they had apogee on the trees, they were in much better shape.
Yes, definitely. I've said this before. We've had conditions like this or worse that I fully, I'm waiting for the bad fire blight to show up, and it just doesn't show up. And I think that is because apogee is doing that background job for us of preventing, it's thickening the cell walls and preventing fire blight from taking off and being much worse than it could be. definitely. And so another reminder, I think your second sprays for apogee should be coming up pretty quickly. So don't miss those, particularly when we're having all this fast growth. Don't delay that. Make sure you keep that on or put it on.
One thing I'm doing is, since the fire blight was severe and I'm not sure I was covered, I'm kicking up my apogee rate by 2 ounces per acre on full bearing trees.
It's a good
Just
idea.
for the second spray.
Yep, good advice. Thanks.
Could you see my screen?
Yep, you look good.
All right, I'm going to talk a little bit about things that winter injury and hedging that you need to do in feathering trees, but really I want to spend my time on thinning and the fruit set model and taking questions in the carbohydrate, actually the carbohydrate model. We are seeing some winter damaged trees that are collapsing now. These are usually in wet areas of the orchard and lower areas. So you'll be seeing that continue for years now with Gala. Galas are looking pretty darn good in places. There's a mixture. Some blocks are pretty heavy, other blocks are okay. So we're going to have to look at our blocks one by one. There's quite a variation in how strong they look. This was just yesterday on this was this morning on Galas. They're at the 10 millimeter stage. We did some Honeycrisp thinning at bloom, full bloom with NAA. This is an untreated check. There's 22 apples. I counted the apples on that one branch, the upper branch here. There's 22 apples on that. Probably I only want 4. So most certainly there's a lot of them hidden in the leaves, and you'll need to thin these. Where we put 4 ounces of NAA on at full bloom, they thinned them down pretty nice. Here's an example where they had two fruits left. And usually I have mostly 1s, some 2s, and a very few 3s where we had this 10 parts per million of NAA at full bloom. We put on 8 ounces of NAA at full bloom on the same size trees and pretty much have singled them down. I don't think anything is over thinned. Even our 12 ounces, we did this just to test over thinning by mistake, and it looks like the trees are going to still have a nice crop, and that's kind of preliminary at this point. I want to review this once again. We are currently in the sweet spot. Right here at 10 millimeter stage is what we consider the sweet spot. Terrence Robinson has defined this more precisely by using degree days, 200 to 250 degree days base 4 Celsius after full bloom is the sweet spot. So this data, all this data here is from 8 years of thinning trials at Clarksville. And one thing you'll notice, there's one time here during this sweet spot where we only thin maybe 20%. Most of the years, year after year after year, we get really good thinning if we're in this time period. And then the door closes pretty fast. Now I'm going to go over the carbohydrate models here quickly. We want stress on the trees. We like to have the stress of the carbohydrate model to be predicted about minus 20 to minus 40, something like that. When we are in a stressful situation, then like this one I just got here, preferred stress, we put a thinner on. Get one of stress. And usually under thinning where we have no stress. And of course, this is what I showed you last year, the sweet spot that Terrence Robinson has defined. And it also corresponds right with the 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 millimeter stage. So if you go to the EnviroWeather system and you want to look at your carbohydrate model predictions day after day, there's a new link right on that page under apples. It says new apple carbohydrate thinning. This goes to the 7-day model. The old model is still there. They told me originally they were going to take that model down, but they didn't do it. So that's still there, the apple carbohydrate model. The old version is a 4-day model. The new version is a 7-day model. You take 2 days before your thinning application, the day of your thinning application, and 4 days afterwards, and that gives you the 7-day carbohydrate model predictions. The old model used the day that you thin plus 3 days following for 4 days total. They found that Terrence and his crew has found that the model better fits or corresponds to a 7-day model rather than a 4-day model. So here is a Sparta 4-day model, and you can see the at the bottom of the chart, it bounces around quite a bit, goes up above 0 and down pretty low from day to day. But here is the 7-day model, and it doesn't bounce around near as much, and I think it gives you a better prediction of what your thinners might do and how much stress the trees have. So here is Sparta for 7 days, and you can see right here we got this light green area. We are right now in the middle of the sweet spot for thinning. If you thin now, you should get good thinning response. Even Terrence's model here says reduce thinning by 15%. I don't think I'd do that. Where I need thinning, I would just use normal rates on your block. Of course, you make the decisions for your own blocks, and you have to look at each block to block. So Sparta, you're right in the sweet spot right now. That means that you should be thinning and not listening to me on the webinar. But anyway, yesterday thinning, today's thinning, and tomorrow thinning will get good response from thinning. And you can see at the bottom here, I got a red box around the carbohydrate model predictions, and we're about a -25, and this is good. That's good for thinning. Your thinners will work. Standale, you're be just leaving your sweet spot, and you probably got some response. You will get some response if you thin the last couple of days, and you'll still get some response if you thin now, because we're still got a little bit of stress for Standale. For Belding, you are just in the middle of the sweet spot, just like Sparta, and you should get good thinning from making applications now. Fremont, you're just entering it. You're a couple days behind us on the ridge and Belding. You're just entering that. Your future looks pretty good here. You're going to have a -25 in the next few days, carbohydrates, and so your thinner should work. You start thinning here the next few days. Today, tomorrow, the next day. Heart, you're a few days off. June 6th is when your sweet spot starts, according to the model. You'll probably be around 10 millimeters. You're probably at 6 millimeters now. You get some thinning at 6 millimeters. So most certainly thin when you have the opportunity. Apples look quite variable, but there's blocks that need thinning. Even some Jonagold blocks I see need some thinning. Each block's different. You got to check each one. Use normal rates. If you have frost damage, consider cutting your rate back a little bit. Cut maybe 5 or 10% out of your thinning rates. On easy thin varieties, for example, you could use 7 or NAA alone. On a difficult to thin variety, NAA, or if you prefer 7 plus Maxell, and I would use normal rates at this point, especially on Gala. Don't look like they have much damage. If you do have frost damage, though, consider that and maybe cut back a little bit or wait a little while to see what's really setting. And we've shown you this before. Right now we're approaching the 10 millimeter stage or at it, so you should get really good thinning, 35% up to maybe 50%. So what I'd like to do is stop right here. The first picture I showed you had apples of all different sizes on there. I think you have to thin in order to not let that 1-year-old wood set up all those little fruits. I can't tell if they're setting or not, but they're starting to grow, and that's a pretty good sign they will set. I think bee activity, pollination, and fertilization were all wonderful, so I think we should have a pretty good set on most everything except for frost damage. Amy, how about if we stop there and I take questions if there are any?